Imagine being in the middle of a storm. The sky is tearing with thunder, the wind shakes everything around, and the world feels like it's collapsing. But there, right at the heart of the storm, there's a place where everything is calm, still, silent. The eye of the hurricane. Silence doesn't live outside the storm. It lives inside it. The human mind is no different. We are surrounded by noise, notifications, opinions, expectations, comparisons, judgments. The world is constantly shouting. And the more we listen to the noise outside, the more we lose the sound of our own soul. But the Stoics knew a secret that many overlook. Silence isn't the absence of sound. It's the presence of awareness. It's where clarity lives. It's where the soul hears what the ego tries to silence. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself in silence while the empire slept. Seneca withdrew to quiet chambers, away from the chaos of court. Epictetus, even surrounded by students, taught in pauses. And above all, he taught to remain silent before responding. To the Stoics, silence wasn't aesthetic. It was a weapon, an invisible sword that cuts through the unnecessary, a shield against impulsiveness, a bridge between reason and virtue. But today, we live in an age where silence feels suspicious. Those who stay quiet are complicit. Those who think too long are wasting time. Those who don't react are seen as weak. Are they? Or is true strength found in not needing to react to everything? In guarding your words when they don't serve truth or peace? In keeping your mind centered while the world falls apart? Silence gives us back what noise steals: presence, clarity, self-mastery. It's where we breathe before we respond, where we observe before we judge, where we understand before we act. And that is a form of wisdom. This video is about that, about the power in being quiet, in listening, in observing, about how silence becomes inner training, where chaos turns to clarity and pain becomes wisdom. And most importantly, how learning to stay silent can teach us how to live. Over the next few minutes, we'll explore 5 dimensions of Stoic silence, 5 ways in which silence can be practiced and used as a true philosophical shield. But before we understand how silence works, we must first understand why it's so rare and so valuable. There's a kind of strength that doesn't display itself. It doesn't lift weights. It doesn't shout. It doesn't threaten. It simply remains. Steady, composed, unshaken. That is the strength of silence. In a world where everything must be said, posted, and commented on, silence feels like a glitch, as if not reacting were a sign of weakness. But the Stoic sees the opposite. To react to everything is to be enslaved by everything. To remain silent is to master. We live in the age of speed. Quick responses, instant opinions, judgments served without pause. But speed without direction is just noise. And silence is the brake that prevents disaster. Epictetus said, "If someone offends you, remember, it is your judgment that disturbs you, not the event itself." Wisdom lies in recognizing that the noise that consumes us rarely comes from outside. The real storm brews within, born from interpretations, fears, and impulses. Picture a still, clear lake. It reflects the sky when it's calm, but throw a stone and the surface distorts. The mind works the same way. Silence is what allows clarity. Its absence muddies everything. How often do we speak just to defend ourselves, to appear right, to preserve an image? But silence needs no defense. It is whole in itself, and that's why it's feared. Marcus Aurelius, both emperor and philosopher, would spend hours in reflection before taking action. Amid wars, political turmoil, and courtly drama, he wrote in silence, not for others, but for himself. Silence is a fortress, he suggested. You don't abandon the fortress just because others are making noise outside it. And in that fortress, the Stoic takes shelter. At this point, silence becomes resistance. Not passive, but powerful. Resistance to the impulse to strike, to the desire to be right, to the addiction of having the last word. Think of a common conflict. A driver cuts off another in traffic. Honking, yelling, insults. Nothing is solved. Everything escalates. But one of them decides to breathe, doesn't respond, doesn't engage. That is true power. The power to interrupt the cycle. So silence isn't submission. It's interruption, a conscious act of not feeding chaos. The irony is, those who need to be heard the most often speak the loudest, and those who are wise speak less, but say more, because their words have been tempered by silence, chosen, refined, considered. In truth, it takes courage to be silent, because silence lays yourself bare. No distractions, no justifications, no audience. Maybe that's why so many fear it, because silence reveals what noise conceals. Internal confusion, unhealed wounds, unfaced fears. But it is precisely in that harsh terrain that the Stoic plants virtue. Each time one chooses silence over reaction, the soul grows stronger. It's like an invisible muscle being trained. Every pause is a repetition. Every deep breath, a gesture of mastery. And over time, something changes. Offenses lose their sting. Pride loosens its grip. And words become tools for building, not weapons for attack. Silence lets us see beneath the surface. It shows us that often, behind an attack is pain. Behind criticism, deep insecurity. Behind a scream, desperation. To respond with anger only multiplies the suffering, but to respond with silence breaks the cycle. Now, be careful. Silence is not omission. It's not pretending nothing matters. It's knowing not everything deserves a reaction. And that's one of Stoicism's greatest teachings. The freedom to choose when to speak, and more importantly, when not to. Seneca wrote, "The most important part of speech is what is left unsaid." Silence carries the wisdom of knowing what doesn't need to be spoken, and it trains us to listen, not just to what others say, but to what they can't say, what lies beneath their tone, their eyes, their pauses. Because silence is also space. Space for the other to exist, to reveal themselves, and for us to understand more deeply. When we become intimate with this space, we stop reacting. We begin reflecting. There's also a practical side to all of this. Silence is often an invitation to introspection, to stop trying to control the external, and begin cultivating the internal. As Seneca put it, to trade noise for meaning. Because where noise rules, thought is lost. But where silence reigns, discernment is born. And it is this discernment we must develop to face an even subtler enemy than the external provocation. A voice that speaks quietly, but constantly. An invisible noise, and far more dangerous. That inner noise is what we'll face next. There's a kind of noise that doesn't come from the outside. It doesn't come from honking horns, buzzing phones, or voices in the room. It comes from within. It's the sound of a mind at war with itself. And that is the hardest silence to master. Have you ever laid your head on the pillow, ready to sleep, only to be ambushed by a storm of thoughts? Did I make the right decision? Why did she say that? What if everything goes wrong tomorrow? That's the inner noise. Silent on the outside, deafening on the inside. The Stoics knew this invisible turbulence well, and they didn't try to conquer it with force, nor did they run from it. They faced it with presence, with awareness, with calm observation. Even Marcus Aurelius, the emperor of Rome, felt this inner unrest. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. That strength doesn't come from silencing the world, but from learning to listen to your own chaos without drowning in it. The mistake many people make is trying to silence the mind through violence, as if thoughts were invaders that need to be expelled. But thoughts aren't enemies to be banished. They're messengers to be understood. And the more we fight them, the louder they get. It's like trying to calm the ocean by slapping the waves. Silence, in this case, doesn't mean a mind free of thoughts. It means a mind free of judgment about those thoughts. It's seeing them like clouds passing by. They come, they go. No attachment, no resistance, no urgency. Epictetus taught his students to distinguish between what we control and what we don't. The mind produces thoughts. That's natural. But we decide which ones we feed, which ones we hold on to, which ones we let drift away. It's like sitting on the side of a busy road. Cars pass. Some catch your attention, but you don't have to chase after every one of them. You can simply watch. That's the Stoic posture toward the mind. Not that of a soldier, but of a watchman. One who sees without reacting, who notices without judging, who accepts without surrendering. In daily life, this shows up in small choices. Breathing before responding to an impulse. pausing before chasing a negative thought, staying quiet before identifying with a fleeting emotion. Because not every thought is true. Not every feeling needs to be acted on. Not every discomfort needs a response. We grow up thinking we must do something about every feeling we have. But the Stoics said otherwise. Sometimes, feeling is enough. Observing is enough. Letting it pass is already an act of strength. That's why inner silence isn't emptiness. It's space. Space for reason to breathe, for the soul to reorganize, for wisdom to rise. And no, you don't need a monastery or a retreat to practice it. It can be cultivated in the middle of chaos, in line at the bank, in the middle of an argument, even in moments when everything seems to fall apart. Silencing the mind doesn't mean turning it off. It means reorganizing it, putting each thing in its proper place. Seneca said, "No wind is favorable to the sailor who doesn't know where he's going." A restless mind is like a ship with no rudder. Silence is the rudder. It gives you direction when everything else pushes you off course. At its core, mental silence isn't a technique. It's a way of relating to life. It's the abandonment of the urge to control everything, and the humble acceptance that not everything needs to be resolved right now. But that acceptance takes practice. It takes vigilance. It takes courage to face what noise was trying to hide. And maybe that's why so many fear silence. Because it reveals. It uncovers anxieties we buried. Fears disguised as productivity. Loneliness dressed up as busyness. Inner noise is often nothing more than what we don't want to face. Unresolved guilt. Unspoken resentments. Dreams we gave up on, but never mourned. Silence makes us look at all of it. And yes, it hurts, but it also heals. It's in silence that we start to distinguish who we truly are from what we only thought we were, to separate the essential from the accidental, to rediscover, within the storm, a clarity that doesn't come from answers, but from presence. So silencing the mind is not an act of escape. It's an act of return, a reunion with who we are beneath the noise, with what remains when everything else falls away. And in that reunion, true strength is revealed. Not the strength of someone who conquers the world, but of someone who conquers themselves. But can we live like this all the time? Can this inner silence become constant, even in a noisy, reactive world? Or are there moments when silence itself must speak? That paradox is what we'll explore next. Some silences scream. They say everything without saying anything at all. A pause before a response. A glance that avoids conflict, yet carries firmness. A still gesture that speaks louder than 1,000 words. Silence, when used well, isn't omission. It's communication. It's intention. It's presence. We live in an age where communication is constant, but rarely deep. We're always saying something. But what exactly are we saying? Too many words, too little meaning. Too much exposure, too little understanding. This excessive speech takes us further from true listening. And when everyone is shouting at once, silence becomes a form of resistance, and also of connection. Seneca, who understood the art of speech better than most, once said, "Speech should be brief if you want it to be heard. More than that, silence is often the most respectful way to listen, to hear not only someone's words, but what lies behind them." Think of the most powerful conversations in your life, the ones that made you reflect, made you cry, made you change. How many of those were filled with long speeches? And how many were made of pauses, heavy breaths, and knowing glances? Silence is space. Space for the other person to exist, to reveal themselves, to let the truth surface without force. In Stoic communication, speaking less doesn't mean being distant. It means being intentional. It's the conscious choice to say only what's necessary and allow the rest to be felt, perceived, absorbed. There's a subtle power in not saying everything, in letting silence complete what words cannot capture, because some truths can only be understood when they're not explained. In his meditations, Marcus Aurelius often speaks to himself in short, simple phrases. No embellishments, no dramatics, just direct access to the essence. If it's not right, don't do it. If it's not true, don't say it. That simplicity doesn't come from limitation, but from depth. A well-placed silence is like the perfect comma in a long sentence, the breath in the middle of a song, the white space in a painting full of color. It gives contrast, and contrast gives meaning. In today's world, this has become a lost art. We're so used to immediacy that we feel obligated to fill every gap with words. A meeting must have chatter. A video must have voice. A message must have a reply. But what if we started valuing what's not said? What if we saw silence not as the absence of dialogue, but as part of it? In personal relationships, silence can be a gesture of deep listening, a sign of respect, even an act of love. The silent presence of someone by your side during pain can heal more than any well-meaning advice. There are silences that comfort, that embrace, that say, "I'm here," without speaking a single word. And there are silences that teach. In the classroom, a great teacher isn't the one who speaks nonstop. It's the one who knows when to stop speaking, so the student can think, so the knowledge can settle, so learning becomes personal. Even in the digital world, silence can be a strategy. A creator who goes quiet for a few days makes more impact upon returning, because the space between appearances creates anticipation, and anticipation is energy. The same applies to difficult conversations. Sometimes, a pause before responding is more powerful than any argument. It shows you're present, that you're thinking, that you're not there to win. You're there to understand. And the same goes for ourselves. How often do we rush to respond to life, to make fast decisions, without giving silence a chance to work within us? The Stoic does not live in haste. He lives with intention, and silence is part of that slower, more conscious, more meaningful rhythm. To be silent, then, is to give space for the truth to reveal itself. Not drag out, not forced, not shaped by anxiety. It's understanding that sometimes the best answer is a pause. That some questions must echo longer before they're answered. That some wounds don't want explanations, just presence. But silence can also be misunderstood. It may come across as coldness, indifference, or detachment. That's why it must be used with wisdom, with empathy, with intention. That's when it becomes not just a language, but a form of presence, a way of being understood, even without words. And when we learn to trust this power, we realize we don't always need to react. We don't always need to reply. We don't always need to explain, because there is something more powerful than sound, more profound than speech, more eloquent than words. Silence, when aligned with virtue, becomes an extension of the soul. But can one live like this in a world so noisy? Can we truly maintain this posture, even when silence puts us in direct conflict with society's expectations? That challenge of living silence as a way of being in a world that demands noise is what we'll explore next. We live in an age that rewards noise. The louder you speak, the more you're heard. The more you expose yourself, the more followers you gain. The quicker your reaction, the more praise, or at least attention, you receive. It's the era of echoes, of urgent opinions, of instant judgment. But where does silence fit in all this? Where does stillness live in a world that demands performance? To the Stoics, silence wasn't a side note. It was a foundation, a deliberate choice, a lived philosophy. Speak only when necessary, and even then, with care. These words, attributed to Epictetus, aren't about shyness. They're about wisdom, about understanding that a life's value isn't in the number of words spoken, but in the integrity of the actions lived. Stoic philosophy teaches that external noise is often the echo of internal disorder. The emptier the soul, the louder it shouts. The more insecure the ego, the more it needs validation. That's why silence becomes revolutionary, because it refuses to play the game. It says, I don't need to prove anything. I don't need to react to exist. I don't need the noise to be real. Adopting silence as a way of life is like slowing down time. It's choosing to observe before judging, to reflect before speaking, to breathe before acting. In everyday life, that might seem strange. You may seem distant, cold, even arrogant, because the world is used to quick reactions, to noise, to constant availability. But the Stoic doesn't live by others' expectations. He lives by reason, by virtue, by what is eternal, not what is urgent. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Live as if someone were watching you, even if no one is." Silence is that inner witness, that presence that keeps you anchored in what is right, even when no one sees it. When you begin to embrace silence, you start noticing what used to go unseen. The tone behind the words, the intention behind the gesture, the pain behind the aggression. You see more because you speak less. You hear more because you interrupt less. Of course, this takes practice, because the world does not cooperate with silence. It pokes, provokes, demands your attention. And every time you choose silence over reaction, it's like lifting a weight in the gym of the soul. Each silent moment is invisible strength training. But living this way comes at a price. Sometimes silence is misunderstood as weakness, as detachment, as indifference. And that's where the real test lies. Are you willing to be misunderstood in order to remain true to yourself? The Stoic is, because he understands that the virtuous life is not always recognized, and that inner peace is worth more than external approval. Practicing silence as a way of life also means learning to embrace solitude, not the kind that wounds, but the kind that heals, the kind that invites you to sit with yourself, to be enough, to witness yourself. Seneca wrote that we should speak with ourselves every day, examine our actions, our impulses, our words, and that kind of inner conversation can only happen when the noise ends. It's in silence that we become aware of the habits that sabotage us, of the patterns that drain us, of the voices we carry that were never ours to begin with. Have you ever stopped to question how many of your beliefs are truly your own? How many of your desires are genuine? And how many were inherited, imposed, absorbed? Silence helps us separate who we are from who we were told to be. It reminds us that we don't have to be available all the time. We don't have to answer everything. We don't have to show up for every argument. The world screams, but you can choose not to scream back. Instead, you can walk slowly, think more, speak less, and live with more intention. Because in the end, the Stoic isn't trying to impress. He's trying to live well, with virtue, with serenity, with clarity. And silence is one of the keys to that. But Stoic silence doesn't mean isolation. It means being in the world without being consumed by it. It means speaking when the truth needs a voice, and remaining silent when words would only serve the ego. It's having presence without needing a stage, depth without needing a speech. And that is rare, which makes it all the more valuable. But what happens when silence demands that we take a stand? When being quiet feels like complicity? When the world expects us to speak? Even when our soul craves silence? There's a kind of silence that isn't noble. There's a moment when staying silent becomes a betrayal. And it's on that fragile, essential line between wisdom and cowardice that we'll walk next. There's a kind of silence that isn't noble. A moment when staying quiet means hiding. A thin line separates silence as virtue from silence as fear. And the Stoics knew this. Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, all recognize that there are times when silence is not wisdom, but disguised escape. When silence becomes a shield for the ego, when it avoids discomfort instead of facing it. To remain silent when justice calls for voice. To remain silent when truth demands to be spoken. To remain silent when another suffers in your absence. These are the silences that weigh heavily. They don't free us. They trap us. They don't protect. They abandon. Imagine a crowd silently watching an injustice. That silence might look like peace, but sometimes it's complicity. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "What is not good for the hive is not good for the bee." A silence that ignores the common good is not Stoic. It is cowardly. Misapplied, the philosophy of silence becomes a way to keep your hands clean, while your heart avoids engagement. It becomes a mask for inaction, a way to avoid being uncomfortable, a means of staying neutral when neutrality becomes neglect. And that is not virtue. That is fear. True Stoic silence is born of courage. The courage to not react when provoked. The courage to listen when everyone is shouting. But also, the courage to speak when it matters. There are moments when words are necessary, not out of pride, but out of duty. When someone is being harmed. When something wrong is being defended as right. When silence would allow falsehood to thrive. In these moments, speaking isn't vanity. It's service. It's reason in defense of justice. Epictetus taught that we should live according to nature. And human nature is social. It implies responsibility toward others. Virtuous silence doesn't ignore the suffering of others. It doesn't hide behind serenity to avoid the discomfort of taking a stand. And so, silence must sometimes be broken, not with shouting, but with clarity, not with anger, but with firmness. The Stoic does not speak to win arguments. He speaks when silence would leave the world colder, darker, more unjust. This applies in our personal relationships as well. How often do we stay quiet to avoid conflict? And in doing so, allow silent resentment to grow inside us. Silence, when used to preserve false peace, can become slow self-betrayal. Because a peace that depends on constant silence is not peace. It's quiet submission. Silence must be a choice, never a cage. And this is why true silence requires discernment, to know when it's strength and when it's actually weakness. This wisdom doesn't come from books. It comes from practice, from self-awareness, from listening deeply to yourself. Ask yourself, am I staying silent out of wisdom or out of fear? Am I preserving harmony or avoiding discomfort? Am I respecting someone else's time or betraying my own? The answers to these questions are not external. They live in the conscience of those committed to living with intention. Because silence can be a shield, but can also become a wall. And too many walls isolate. They separate us from the world, from others, from ourselves. Virtuous silence builds bridges. Cowardly silence digs trenches. There's also another danger, pride disguised as restraint. That kind of silence that refuses to speak out of superiority, out of disdain, out of the refusal to lower oneself. That is not Stoic silence. That's ego in disguise. It's the silence of someone who would rather avoid connection than risk vulnerability, who would rather appear composed than genuinely understand. Why silence draws people closer. Prideful silence pushes them away. Seneca warned against this kind of detachment. We must live in society as on a battlefield, alert, but never alienated. Silence must never be an excuse to abandon others, to retreat from the world, to hide from the responsibility of being in relationship. Stoicism is not a philosophy for monasteries. It's for the real world, for family, for work, for conflict, for community. And in the real world, silence must be measured. It must be conscious. It must be sincere. Speaking when needed is also an act of compassion, of maturity, of virtue. Because some words heal, some words guide, some words awaken. To withhold them out of fear, pride, or comfort is to waste a chance to serve the world. In the end, silence is a tool. And like any tool, it can build or it can destroy. It all depends on how and why you use it. And when you learn to recognize that line, you begin to live with less noise and far more truth. But now, after all of this, how do we bring this wisdom into our lives? How do we carry Stoic silence into our daily routine? In a world that's so loud, reactive, and anxious? That's what we'll explore in the final part. How silence becomes not just a practice, but a state of being. In the end, silence isn't a destination. It's a path. It isn't emptiness. It's presence of what truly matters, of what doesn't need to prove itself to exist. It's where the soul finally breathes, and the heart understands. We live surrounded by voices, opinions, demands. But deep down, what we long for is that rare moment of inner stillness. Not an escape, but a return to the center of ourselves, where the world stops shouting and consciousness begins to whisper. Stoic silence is not passivity. It's contained power. It's the space between stimulus and response, between chaos and clarity, between impulse and virtue. And in that space lies freedom, the freedom to not react out of habit, to not be pulled by the noise, to live with intention, even when everything around us pushes toward anxiety. The great masters of the soul, Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, Epictetus, they understood this. They knew wisdom doesn't shout. It watches. It listens. It speaks only when it must. And often, it chooses silence. There is a rare strength in the person who has made peace with stillness. They don't need to win arguments to feel powerful. They don't need to react to everything to feel alive. They walk in peace, and that's enough. But for silence to be real, it must be practiced, not admired as an idea, lived in gestures, in pauses, in the conversations we don't have, and in the responses we choose not to give. It begins small, in a moment of solitude at the end of the day. A coffee sipped in stillness, a thought observed, but not fed. It's in those ordinary pauses that silence becomes habit. Habit becomes posture. Posture becomes philosophy. If something in this video spoke to you, if an image, an idea, a reflection resonated with your inner world, give yourself permission to practice this silence. Today, now, even if only for a few minutes. Close your eyes, take a breath, and listen, not to the world, but to yourself. You may find that silence has sound, texture, depth, and often, it's there that you truly meet yourself. If this journey made sense to you, if something here brought you clarity, peace, or strength, I invite you to continue walking with us. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, like this video if it moved you, and if you feel called, share in the comments. What was the most transformative silence in your life? Sometimes, it's in sharing a pause that we find echoes of who we really are. And each quiet comment, each silent presence, helps spread the serenity this world so deeply needs. Because in the end, we're not here just to consume ideas. We're here to live them. And perhaps, silence is the first step toward truly hearing the soul.